My name is Elena Russo, and when I stepped off that plane on Christmas Eve, the last thing I expected was an itemized bill for my childhood. I had flown 12 hours from Seattle to Boston, dragging a suitcase full of gifts through 3 airports, my hands blistered and my back screaming. Snow fell softly outside the terminal windows, the kind of gentle winter scene that belonged on greeting cards. Inside, my Aunt Marianne stood at arrivals with her arms crossed. No hug, no smile, just a folded piece of paper extended toward me like a parking ticket. "Here's what you owe for your room and meals this week," she said, her voice flat and businesslike. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might be sick right there on the polished airport floor. An invoice? On Christmas Eve? I stared at the paper, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it, unable to form words. My heart twisted in my chest, caught between disbelief and a horrible, sinking recognition. This was not a joke. This was not a misunderstanding. This was exactly who they had always been, and I had just been too afraid to see it clearly until now. The car ride to the house was silent except for the hum of tires on salted pavement. I sat in the back seat, clutching that invoice like it was evidence in a trial I had not known I was part of. My Aunt Marianne drove, her eyes fixed on the road. My Uncle Frank sat beside her, scrolling through his phone. Neither of them asked how my flight was. Neither of them mentioned the gifts I had wrapped carefully and packed between layers of clothes to keep them from breaking. I kept my eyes on the passing streetlights, trying to steady my breathing. The paper in my hands listed charges in neat printed rows. Room and board for 7 days, holiday meal contributions, utilities usage, gift exchange participation fee. Each line felt like a slap, calculated and deliberate. I wanted to ask if this was some kind of test, some twisted family tradition I had missed in all the years I had been away. But my throat was too tight, and the silence in that car told me everything I needed to know. They were serious. They had planned this, and they expected me to pay without question, the way I always had. Dinner that night unfolded like a performance I had not been invited to rehearse. The table was set with Aunt Marianne's good china, the kind she only used when she wanted to impress someone. My cousins, Tyler and Vanessa, sat across from me, laughing about something that had happened at Tyler's office party. Presents were stacked under a tree in the corner, each one wrapped in expensive paper with bows that matched the room's color scheme. I picked at my plate, pushing green beans around with my fork, trying to look normal. My Uncle Frank glanced at my checkbook sitting on the edge of the table where I had left it after pulling out my ID at the airport. His eyes lingered there, just for a second, like he was doing mental math. I felt a familiar weight settle over me, the same one I had carried since I was 10 years old. Years of being the kid who swept floors in their shop to pay for school supplies. Years of scholarships and late-night shifts while my cousins had tutors and new laptops. I wondered if anyone at this table noticed the tightness in my jaw or the way my hands shook slightly when I reached for my water glass. I wondered if they even cared. After dinner, I excused myself and went upstairs to the small guest room they had assigned me. It was the same room I had stayed in every Christmas since I was a child, the one with the narrow bed and the window that never quite closed all the way. I sat on the edge of the mattress and pulled out my phone, scrolling through old messages and bank statements. I did not plan to do this. It just happened, like my fingers knew what my brain was still refusing to accept. I found receipts from the last 5 years, plane tickets I had bought to visit them, gifts I had purchased for birthdays and holidays, groceries I had paid for when I stayed here during college breaks. Every single transaction was still saved in my email, time-stamped and categorized. I remembered being 10, standing in their shop after school, sweeping sawdust off the floor because Aunt Marianne said it was the least I could do to earn my keep. I remembered applying for scholarships in secret because asking them for help felt like admitting I was a burden. The injustice was subtle, the kind that built up so slowly you did not notice until it crushed you. I sat there in the cold room, staring at the numbers on my screen, and realized something that made my chest ache. I had been proving myself to them my entire life, and it had never mattered. Not once. The next morning, Christmas Day, Aunt Marianne brought up the invoice again over breakfast. She did it casually, like she was discussing the weather. "So, Alina, We figured it's only fair that you contribute, she said, pouring herself coffee. You're an adult now, you have a good job. We're not asking for much. She slid a second piece of paper across the table, this one with the charges broken down even further. Boarding for 7 nights at $100 per night, meals calculated at $30 per day, holiday utilities, gift exchange fees, even a line for emotional labor and hosting efforts. I stared at the total, my stomach twisting. It was more than my flight had cost, more than I had spent on all the presents I brought. My throat tightened as I realized this was not about fairness. This was about control. This was about making sure I understood my place in this family, which had always been at the bottom, always owing, always expected to give without receiving. My Uncle Frank glanced at me over his newspaper, waiting for a response. My cousins said nothing, their eyes glued to their phones. I folded the paper carefully, tucked it into my pocket, and forced a smile. I'll take care of it, I said quietly. But inside, a decision was forming, cold and clear. It was time to keep score. I spent that afternoon alone in my room, going through everything I had saved over the years. Bank statements from college, scholarship letters that showed how much financial aid I had received and how little help the family had provided. Receipts from family dinners where I had quietly covered the bill because Aunt Marianne claimed she had forgotten her wallet. Emails where I had offered to help with rent or groceries during tight months, only to watch them post photos of new furniture and weekend trips the following week. I opened a blank spreadsheet on my laptop and started entering numbers. Every dollar I had given. Every time they had refused to help when I needed it most. Every birthday gift I had bought for cousins who never remembered mine. My fingers shook slightly as I typed, but my mind was sharp and focused. I was not doing this out of anger. I was doing it because I needed to see the truth laid out in front of me, undeniable and clear. When I finished, I stared at the total, over $15,000 in the last 8 years. $15,000 I had given to a family that had just handed me an invoice for $700. I saved the file and titled it simply, Evidence. That evening, I started noticing patterns I had missed before. The way Aunt Marianne always mentioned money when I was around, dropping hints about bills or repairs that needed funding. The way Uncle Frank would casually ask about my salary or my savings, disguising it as friendly curiosity. The way my cousins treated my presence like a convenience, asking me to watch their kids or pick up groceries without ever offering to pay me back. I realized that every visit home followed the same script. I would arrive with gifts and good intentions. They would take what I offered and then ask for more. And I would leave feeling guilty for not doing enough, for not being grateful enough, for existing in their space at all. I thought about all the Christmases where I had bought presents for everyone while receiving generic gift cards in return, if anything. I thought about the birthdays where I sent money and received nothing but a quick text weeks later. Gratitude had never been part of the family language, expectation was, and I had been fluent in it my entire life. On the second night, I overheard Aunt Marianne on the phone in the hallway. Her voice carried through the thin walls, bright and boastful. "Oh, Elena's here for the week," she was saying to someone. "She's doing so well now, making great money in Seattle. She's always so generous with the family." There was a pause, then a laugh. "Of course she helps out. That's just who she is." I stood frozen in my room, my hand on the doorknob, listening to her turn my exhaustion into a virtue and my compliance into character. She was bragging about how much I spent, how much I gave, how reliable I was, but she said it like I was a resource, not a person. Like my value was measured entirely in what I could provide. My anger simmered quietly, controlled and sharp. I did not storm into the hallway. I did not confront her in that moment. Instead, I opened my laptop again and added a new section to my spreadsheet. Conversations. I noted the date, the time, and exactly what I had heard. Then I made a decision. I would confront them, but only when I had proof they could not dismiss or twist. Only when I was ready. The next day, I spent hours cross-referencing everything. Old receipts from family dinners, screenshots of Venmo transactions, emails where I had offered to help with expenses, work logs from the summers I had spent in their shop unpaid, while my cousins earned allowances for doing nothing. I matched every contribution I had made with a corresponding moment where they had refused to support me. The time I needed help with college textbooks, and Aunt Marianne said she could not afford it, then posted photos of a new living room set 2 weeks later. The time Uncle Frank borrowed money for car repairs and never paid me back. The time I covered Vanessa's bridesmaid dress because she claimed she was broke, only to see her buy concert tickets the same month. Every transaction was cataloged. Every inconsistency was documented. The chaos of years spent feeling guilty and confused was replaced by calm, focused intent. I finally knew exactly how much they had taken, and I knew exactly how to show them. I decided to test them just once to see if anything had changed. At breakfast, I casually mentioned that I could cover the grocery bill for the week if it would help. Aunt Marianne looked at me with barely concealed irritation. "Elena, that's your duty," she said, her tone sharp. "Your family. You're supposed to help out." Uncle Frank nodded without looking up from his coffee. "We took you in when you had no one else. The least you can do is contribute." I smiled tightly and said nothing, but I pulled out my phone under the table and started a voice recording, tucking it into my pocket. They were still underestimating me. They still thought I was the same scared kid who would do anything to avoid conflict, who would swallow guilt and keep giving until there was nothing left. They had no idea that I had changed, that I had been documenting, that I was finally done playing the role they had written for me. That afternoon, I discovered something I had not expected. Going through old emails, I found a thread between Aunt Marianne and a scholarship fund I had applied for in college. The fund had sent a check directly to her, intended to help cover my living expenses while I stayed with them during breaks. The amount was significant, enough to cover food, transportation, and supplies for an entire semester. But I had never seen that money. I had worked late shifts at a campus cafe to pay for textbooks, I had walked miles to save on bus fare, and the entire time that money had been sitting in their account, used for things that had nothing to do with me. My hands trembled as I saved the email chain. This was not just neglect, this was theft. And now I had proof. I added it to my spreadsheet, highlighted in red, and labeled it clearly, misused funds. I did not know yet what I would do with this information, but I knew it was a weapon, quiet and devastating. The next evening, I asked Uncle Frank about a family expense from 3 years ago. A vacation they had taken and claimed I had contributed to, even though I had no memory of agreeing to help. He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, then shrugged. "We all chipped in," he said vaguely. "It was shared equally." I did not argue. I simply pulled out my laptop, opened my spreadsheet, and turned the screen toward him. His eyes scanned the rows of data, the dates, the amounts, the notes. His face went pale. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tight. "This is what actually happened," I said calmly. "Every dollar I gave, every time you said we shared equally, every time you forgot to pay me back." He stared at the screen, his jaw working like he wanted to say something but could not find the words. For the first time in my life, I saw doubt flicker in his eyes, the first crack in his confidence. I closed the laptop and stood up. "I'll let you think about it," I said, and walked out of the room. Over the next 2 days, I began quietly returning things, not physically, but financially. I canceled automatic payments I had set up for their streaming services. I removed myself from their family phone plan, which I had been covering for the last 2 years. I stopped funding the small expenses I had taken on without thinking, the ones that added up over time but never got acknowledged. I did it all politely, with receipts and explanations sent via email. No yelling, no drama, just facts. Aunt Marianne called me into the kitchen after the third cancellation notice arrived. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "I'm setting boundaries," I said calmly. "I'm stopping payments for things that were never my responsibility." She stared at me, shocked, like she could not believe I was capable of saying no. "You're being selfish," she said finally. I met her eyes. "No," I replied. "I'm being fair." The air in the house changed after that. Conversations became strained. My cousins stopped asking me to run errands. Uncle Frank avoided eye contact at meals. I maintained my composure, even as I felt the tension building around me. I knew they were talking about me behind closed doors, trying to figure out what had shifted. But I did not care. For the first time in my life, I was not bending to make them comfortable. I was standing still, and they were the ones who had to adjust. On the fourth night, I found Vanessa waiting for me in the hallway. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I nodded, and we sat on the stairs together. She was silent for a long time, then finally said, "I didn't know how bad it was, the way they treated you." I looked at her, surprised. "You saw it," I said. "You were there." She nodded slowly. "I saw it, but I didn't want to believe it, and I'm sorry. It was not enough to fix everything, but it was the first real acknowledgement I had ever received from anyone in this family." I called a family meeting on the 6th day. I did not ask. I simply told them we were gathering in the living room after dinner, and I expected everyone to be there. When the time came, I set my laptop on the coffee table and opened my spreadsheet. The room was silent, except for the hum of the heater. "I've been keeping track," I said, my voice steady, "of every dollar I've given this family, of every time you asked for help and never returned it, of every moment you made me feel like I owed you something for existing." I turned the screen so they could all see. Rows and rows of data. Dates, amounts, notes, everything documented and undeniable. Aunt Marianne's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Uncle Frank leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. Tyler and Vanessa stared at the screen like they were seeing a stranger. I let the silence sit for a moment, then continued. "You gave me an invoice for $700, but according to this, you owe me over $15,000. Uncle Frank tried to speak, his voice trembling. "Elena, this is fair," I interrupted. "This is fair." Aunt Marianne tried to gaslight me. She said I was exaggerating, that I was remembering things wrong, that families do not keep score like this. But every time she made a claim, I had a receipt to disprove it. A bank statement, an email, a screenshot. The power in the room shifted visibly. Uncle Frank, who had always been so sure of himself, looked small and uncertain. Vanessa stared at her hands. Tyler scrolled through his phone, avoiding eye contact. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The numbers spoke louder than any argument I could make. When Aunt Marianne finally fell silent, I reached into my bag and pulled out the invoice they had given me. I had annotated it in red ink, adding my own calculations. At the bottom, I had written in bold letters, "Total owed to Elena, $0." I slid it across the table. "Here's what I actually owe," I said. They looked at each other, unsure how to respond. The irony was quiet but sharp, and it hung in the air like smoke. I told them I was done funding their lives, done covering expenses that were not mine, done pretending this was normal. "I'm closing every payment I've been making," I said calmly. "The streaming services, the phone plan, the groceries, all of it." Aunt Marianne's face went red. "You can't just cut us off," she said, her voice shaking. "We're family." "Family doesn't charge each other invoices," I replied. Uncle Frank slammed his hand on the table. "We took you in when no one else would," he said, his voice rising. "You owe us." I shook my head. "I don't, and I'm done pretending I do." The tension in the room was thick, heavy, almost suffocating, but I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I had set a boundary and held it. No apologies, no guilt, just firm, quiet limits. The next day, Aunt Marianne tried to rewrite the story. I heard her on the phone with a neighbor, telling them I had become selfish, that I had turned my back on the family after everything they had done for me. She said it loud enough for me to hear, like she wanted me to feel ashamed. But I did not react. I let her talk. I knew the truth, and I had the receipts to prove it. Later that afternoon, I contacted a legal advisor through a consultation service. I explained the situation with the misused scholarship funds. They told me I had a case, that I could reclaim the money if I wanted to pursue it. I thanked them and hung up. I did not know yet if I would take that step, but I liked knowing I had the option, that I was not powerless anymore. Tyler found me in the kitchen that evening. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Look," he said, "I get that you're mad, but can't you just let it go? For the sake of peace?" I turned to face him. "Peace for who?" I asked. "Because I've been keeping the peace my entire life, and it cost me everything." He did not have an answer for that. He just looked at me, then walked away. I realized then that some people in this family would never understand. They would always see boundaries as cruelty, fairness as betrayal. And I was okay with that, because their comfort was no longer my responsibility. On my last night in Boston, Vanessa came to my room. She sat on the edge of the bed and handed me a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this a while ago," she said quietly. "I just didn't know how to give it to you." I unfolded it. It was a letter, handwritten, apologizing for the way the family had treated me, for standing by and saying nothing, for benefiting from my silence. "I don't know if this changes anything," she said, "but I wanted you to know." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something I had not expected. Regret. "It doesn't fix the past," I said, "but it's a start." She nodded, tears in her eyes, and left the room. It was the first time anyone in this family had acknowledged what had happened without making excuses. I left the next morning before anyone else woke up. I did not leave a note. I did not say goodbye. I just packed my things, called a car, and walked out into the cold December air. The snow was still falling, soft and quiet, covering the streets in white. As the car pulled away from the house, I looked back one last time. The lights were off. The driveway was empty. It looked smaller than I remembered. I thought about the invoice tucked in my suitcase, annotated and returned. I thought about the spreadsheet saved on my laptop, proof of everything they had taken, and I thought about the boundary I had finally set, the line I had drawn in the snow. I was not angry anymore. I was not sad. I was just done. Back in Seattle, I started rebuilding. I closed the joint accounts I had shared with the family. I changed my phone number. I blocked Aunt Marianne and Uncle Frank on social media. It felt strange at first, like cutting off a limb, but it also felt necessary. I focused on work, on friends who actually cared, on the life I had built for myself far away from Boston. Slowly, the guilt started to fade. The voice in my head that said I owed them something, that I was being selfish, grew quieter. I realized that setting boundaries was not cruelty. It was survival. A few weeks later, I received an email from Vanessa. She said the family was struggling without the money I had been contributing, that Aunt Marianne had to pick up extra shifts, that Uncle Frank was selling things to cover bills. She did not ask me to come back. She just wanted me to know. I read the email twice, then archived it. I felt a small pang of something, maybe sadness, maybe relief, but I did not feel guilty. They had made their choices. Now they were living with the consequences. And for the first time in my life, I was living with mine too. Months passed. Spring came to Seattle, bringing rain and new growth. I started seeing a therapist who helped me unpack years of feeling like I was never enough. I joined a community group for people who had grown up in complicated family situations. I learned that I was not alone, that boundaries were healthy, that walking away did not make me a bad person. One afternoon, I received a package in the mail. Inside was a letter from Uncle Frank. He apologized for the invoice, for the years of taking without giving, for making me feel like I owed them my entire life. He said he understood if I never wanted to speak to them again. I read the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in a drawer. I did not know if I would ever respond, but I appreciated the acknowledgement. Last Christmas, I stayed in Seattle. I spent the holiday with friends, cooking dinner and watching movies. No invoices, no guilt, no expectations, just warmth and laughter and people who saw me as more than what I could provide. It was the best Christmas I had ever had. I thought about my family back in Boston, wondered if they were thinking about me, but the thought did not hurt anymore. It was just a fact, a distant memory of a life I had left behind. I had chosen myself, and that choice had saved me. Now, I look back on that Christmas Eve and feel something close to gratitude. Not for what they did, but for what it taught me. I learned that loyalty without respect is just servitude. That family is not defined by blood, but by how people treat you. That walking away is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. I still have the invoice, tucked in a folder with all my other evidence. I do not look at it often, but I keep it as a reminder of the moment I stopped being their ATM and started being my own person. So let me ask you something. If your family ignored your struggles for years and then handed you a bill for existing, what would you do? Would you pay it, smile, and keep the peace? Or would you do what I did and finally choose yourself, even if it meant walking away from everyone you had ever known? I chose myself, and I have never looked back.